Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. Let me know in the forum if there's any problem with sound. Let me know in the forum if there's any problem with sound. Let me know in the forum if there's any problem with sound. So basically, I have some slides that I'll go through, but as I go along, if anyone wants to look at any real example, we can. If there are people in the forum who, have questions, feel free to ask, and I'll do what I can to answer them, or someone else can jump in if you have some knowledge about it. By the way, there is a delay on the broadcast, like 10 or 15 seconds, so you're not going to see me exactly live. So this talk has been inspired by my experience of being the website chair for DjangoCon. So it's our website is hosted on GitHub, and so you can see there's a screenshot of our website. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad to have the opportunity to share what I've learned, a little bit about what my goal is. I want to get all of you started collaborating and doing code review as quickly as possible. Wait just a second. So I'm going to show you a lot of screenshots and diagrams because I want you to understand what the process looks like. I'm going to take a moment to fix something. I've got a technical problem. Okay, that's better. Thanks for waiting. So a little bit about me. Like I said, I'm the DjangoCon website chair. I'm a definite board member. I'll be on the DjangoCon Europe website committee, and I'm a project manager, web designer, and developer. So, you know, there are far more maintainers and collaborators who are men than women. And one of my goals is that I want to take my experience and I want to use it to increase the level of participation of women. I want to save you from having the frustration that I went through. I wish I had taken on more responsibility sooner. When I saw people who were maintainers, I felt like they kind of had their own territory and that, you know, I wasn't the kind of person who fit as a maintainer, or I didn't know how to get started. And the way that they did it was a mystery to me. I had no idea. So once I became a maintainer, I learned as I went along. I made mistakes in front of people. I had to sometimes ask senior developers to explain things to me, or spend time, some hours researching online because it's not always obvious how to do it. Fortunately, I have been a maintainer in a really supportive environment, but I want all of you to benefit from my trial and error. So I want you to know that collaboration and code review is a real process that you can learn and use. And like I said, I'm going to show you a lot of screenshots and diagrams so you understand what the process looks like. And at the end of my presentation, there will be an opportunity to practice reviewing a pull request. I can give each of you a repository that you will have admin access to where you can practice. You can do it today or in the future because it will be there indefinitely. And in my opinion, this is highly valuable because if you learn the process first, you can be more confident to seek out opportunities to collaborate and maintain. I'm just going to check the forum and see see if there's any question or anything for me, if I can find it. Apologies because I'm occasionally having a few technical problems, so sorry about that. Okay, so my slides and a replay of my talk will be online later. And I've got a repo with useful resources. And in my last slide, there will be a link to the resources. There will be documentation and all of the commands that I'll be showing you today. Like I said, if you take part in the simulation exercise, the repo will be there indefinitely so you can practice and experiment. And of course, you're welcome to contact me if you have any questions. So firstly, I want to tell you how I got started in open source contribution, because it shows that there are interesting ways to get involved. I first signed up for GitHub back in April of 2013, and I didn't know how to get started. My account sat unused for about 7 months. And one day I happened to be looking at Twitter, and I saw a tweet from a man named Dan Sinker. He had made a really delicious taco meal, and he had decided to start a project on GitHub to share taco recipes. So I clicked on the link and I went to the project to take a look. And there was one sentence in the project information that had a huge impact on me, and it was, "Are you new to GitHub but want to contribute?" Well, that was me. I became very determined to contribute, and I submitted my first pull request there. I guess it was the fact that, you know, I felt completely welcome to contribute, even if I was new. So I kept using Git and GitHub, and I kept getting better at it, although, like I said, I did not take on responsibility as quickly as I wish I had. But I found this really incredible community for DjangoCon, the conference, and I became a website contributor in 2016. Then I became the website chair and a maintainer in 2017. And I'm going to use DjangoCon US website as an example throughout my talk. So firstly, let's be clear about what GitHub is. It's a website built on the version control software Git. It reminds me a little bit of Facebook. It's a social network. You can make a user profile, you can follow people, you can follow their activity in your news feed and find interesting projects. But the really important part of GitHub is that users can store and work on code together in repositories. For example, you can actually go to the DjangoCon US organization account, and there is a list of repos there, and at the top is the DjangoCon, at the top of this screenshot is the DjangoCon US website repo. If you click on the hyperlink, it will open up the repo and you can see the folders and files filled with the website code, and you can look through it because it's open source code. But when we are working on code, we can't do everything in the GitHub website. For example, DjangoCon US website, you can't really run it in GitHub. So you might want to make a copy of it in the local development environment of your computer and install the necessary software and run the code in a local browser so that you can add a feature to it or test a pull request. This is where Git is really useful, because you can install it in your local development environment and use it in the command line of your computer. And you can basically use it to take a snapshot of your project at any point in time, and you can revert back to the snapshot if you need to. So on the screen is a screenshot of my local development environment. And in the background, I have GitHub open in my browser. And in front of that, I have my local folder window in my command line. And I can take the web address from the GitHub repo in the command line, and I can use it to create a copy of the repo in my local development environment. This is called cloning. I can make changes and push the changes back to GitHub. And meanwhile, other users can do the same thing on their computers. And I'm going to go through this process much more in detail later on, but I wanted to give you an idea of what we're trying to do. So I think I'm just going to check the forum and make sure there aren't any questions for me right now. Okay, and hopefully, if you have any problems or if you have any questions, feel free to say something in the forum. So there's something that I don't hear people talk about much that I think is really important in collaboration and code review, especially as your level of responsibility increases. You need to have the freedom to switch between multiple tasks. You need to, for instance, keep your main code branch up to date. This may be your master branch, for instance. You may want to create one or more features, and of course, if you become a maintainer, you'll probably do code review, and you may need to do these things, intermittently. So when I first started using GitHub, I would pretty often go into my own GitHub repo, click on a file, click on the pencil icon to open the file, make a change, and save it. This is okay, but imagine if there are multiple people all working on a repo and all of them are just going into files and making changes and saving them. It's not very practical. For one thing, people would have a hard time giving feedback like that if people are just making the changes in real time. Plus, sometimes, for instance, with DjangoCon US website, the actual master branch is deployed live. When you make a change to it, that change goes directly to the website. So there's actually a way to make changes that enables you to switch between multiple tasks the way that you need to collaborate and do code review. And that is through branches. Branches are a best practice, and they can be used by any GitHub user. When you create a repo, by default, you are working within a branch named master. So say, for instance, you want to make a change in the branch. You can make a copy of the entire master branch and give it a different name. So now there are two branches in the same repo, the master branch and a feature branch. GitHub will also refer to a feature branch as a topic branch, by the way. So you can create an unlimited number of branches and you can switch in between them to work on them. And at some point when a feature branch author thinks it's done, they might submit a pull request and the feature branch will become a pull request branch. If the changes are accepted, they're merged into, in this case, the master branch. So the master branch will be like before, except with the changes from the branch. But something that I think is really helpful to know when you are getting better at collaboration and code review, both feature branches and pull request branches are simply branches, and you can work on them basically in the same way, which I'll talk about a bit later. So let's go back to the screenshot of editing a file in GitHub. Before you click Save, there is a radial button you can choose to indicate that you want to create a new branch. There is also a place to give the branch a new name. So then when you click Save, you are not saving in the current file. Instead, a new branch will be created. You can also create and work on branches through the command line in your local development environment, which I'm going to show you a bit later. So here's an overview of what we're going to do today. We're going to determine which collaboration approach to use. We're going to clone a repo into our local development environment, create a feature branch, make a change to the branch, push the branch to the GitHub repo we cloned from, and submit a pull request to the DjangoCon US website repo. Then we'll talk about how to review the two different types of pull requests. There are two different types because there are two different collaboration approaches. So depending on which collaboration approach you use, you will have a different, the maintainer reviewing the pull request might have slightly different instructions. So then I'll have some additional workflow and command info. I'll have some people, communication, documentation, information, some recommendations, and then we'll have an exercise. So firstly, let's determine which collaboration approach to use. I'm gonna try to check the form and see if there's someone has asked if it's bad practice to branch off from a feature branch. I don't think it's bad practice, but it's not common. I'm going to talk about, in a little while, I'm going to talk about advanced workflows. I do occasionally come across some, blog post where someone talks about it. Maybe we will come across something in the advanced workflow. For instance, if someone has to fix a bug, but let's look into that in a bit. Thank you for the question. So there is a kind of fancy term, collaborative development model, and it basically just means how people work on code together. So there are two different models. There is the shared repository model and a fork and pull model. And these two different models typically, not always, but typically correspond to the two different account types. And the model you use depends on whether you have write permission to the repo. So there are the two different account types are organization accounts, such as the DjangoCon organization, and user accounts, such as my own personal user account. When we talk about write permission, it's a computer term. It's not like write in the context of English, like writing an essay. When a user has write permission to a repo, it means that they can make changes directly inside of the repo. So for example, a person who has write permission could go into a file and make a change and click save. Or they could push a branch directly to the repo instead of through a fork, which I'll talk about in a bit. They also could merge and close pull requests. And there's actually, in the notes I'll give you, there is a chart in GitHub. There's an article called Repository Permission Levels for an Organization. And it will actually have a chart showing the different permissions for people who have read access, which is an access that involves less access than write permission. It will tell you about write permission and being an owner, and it will actually show you in the chart what the differences are between those different accesses. So why do we need write permission? Here's an example. The DjangoCon US website is deployed live from the master branch, like I said, and it has a pretty high volume of traffic. We wouldn't want just anyone to be able to come along and make a change inside of the DjangoCon repo. So the owners of the organization occasionally will give write permission to someone. And there's often a level of trust involved in having it. So let's look at a couple examples. First, we'll look at the shared repository model. Typically, a shared repository is found in an organization account, which an easy way to remember this is the word shared. That, often in an organization, you'll come across repos where groups are sharing the work. So for example, this year I became a maintainer of the DjangoCon US website. So I was given write permission to the DjangoCon US website repo, which is a shared repository. So along with the other maintainers who also have write permission, I can make changes directly inside of the repo. The fork and pull model is typically used in user account repos. For example, when I first came across the DjangoCon US website repo, I wanted to contribute, but I was not a maintainer, so I didn't have write permission. So I made a copy, which is called a fork. I made a copy of the DjangoCon US website repo into my user account, which I have write permission to. That's how it works. You have write permission to your own user account repos, whether they be a repo you created yourself or forked. As the owner of that account, you have write permission. So after I would fork the DjangoCon US website repo, I would make a change and submit a pull request to the DjangoCon US website repo. So here is how you fork. For example, you could go to the DjangoCon US website repo and click the fork button. And then, or you can try to edit a file that you do not have write permission to, and GitHub will automatically fork the repo to your user account. There will be a message notifying you that it's being forked, and the forking message will lead you back to your user account or wherever you are forking to. And in the list of repos in your account, you will now see an entry for the fork, and it will tell you that it's a fork and where the fork came from. And if you click on the hyperlink, it will open the repo, and notice that the repo URL will have my user account name in it because it's under my user account now. The fork is an exact copy of the original repo at the time it was forked. And I can make any changes I want to it, including deleting it. I can delete my fork. I remember that's something I wondered about when I first forked a repo. The original repo will not be affected. In addition, so you can fork to propose a change, but just so you know, you can also fork to use the code as a starting point for a new idea of your own, depending on the license. I want to tell you a few interesting things. Now, what I've told you, the examples I've told you about are what are typical, but it's interesting to know that even though a shared repository is often found in an organization account, you can create a shared repository in your own user account by inviting other people to be collaborators. It's just not nearly as common. On the other hand, like I said, typically users are forking repos into their user account, but an organization, a person who's a member of an organization can also fork a repo into an organization. And also you can fork basically any public repo as far as I know. It doesn't just have to be a shared repository. You can fork somebody else's user account repo and possibly contribute to it. But it is good to know that there are a few advantages to using an organizational repo as a shared repository instead of a user account repo. And it's because in an organization account, the owners can create teams and permissions across multiple repos. Otherwise, a shared repository settings are basically the same. The teams and permissions are at an organization level. But if you create a shared repository in your user account, you're just inviting people individually to a repo. You're not going to be able to have teams and permissions. So I thought it'd be good to just go over a few examples of write permission. I guess I've kind of maybe covered these, but just to make it clear. So an organization account maintainer is an example. A user account owner as the owner of all of the repos in your account, and a user account collaborator if you're invited to collaborate on a user account repo as a shared repository. So I talked about earlier that it's best to use branches, and I was kind of talking about it in general, but I think this is useful to know. It's also a good idea to use branches in a fork, and I want to tell you why. Say, for instance, that you fork a repo and you go into a file in like the master branch, for instance, and you make a change and you submit a pull request. This is okay. If say, for instance, you only want to make, that change, then it's fine. But you're basically stuck waiting for the pull request to be resolved. Because normally, if you want to make a new branch, you want the branch you're branching off of to be basically up to date. Well, you have changed your master branch. So, you're not going to have an up-to-date branch to branch off of. You could delete the fork and refork it to make it up to date. But if you have a pull request pending, what happens when you delete is that the pull request becomes known as an inactive pull request. And it's harder for the maintainer and harder for you to work on it in the future if you decide to. So that's another example of why it's much better to just keep your main branch up to date and use branches like we talked about earlier. So now we're going to look at how to clone a repo into our local development environment. We'll create a feature branch, make a change, push the branch to the GitHub repo we cloned from, and submit a pull request to the Django HunUS website repo. So I made a couple of diagrams that I hope will give you an idea of what the process is for working locally for each collaborative development model. I'm just going to check the forum quickly and see if there's any question. I don't see any. Okay. So for the fork and pull model, you fork the repo, and then you clone the fork into your local development environment. And at this point, Git is going to track some details about your project. For instance, Git will know where you cloned from. And in relation to the clone on your local development environment, the GitHub repo is now considered a remote repo. And Git will assign the name origin to it. And we can use the name origin in the command line to refer to the repo so that we can push and pull changes back and forth between the local development environment and the GitHub repo. So we make our changes, we push the changes back to the fork and submit a pull request. This is what it looks like in contrast when we use the shared repository model. We don't need a fork because we have write permission. And this was something kind of hard for me to figure out when I first became a maintainer. So you clone the shared repository directly into your local development environment. And the shared repository is now your remote origin. So you can push and pull directly back and forth between the shared repository and your local development environment because you have access. So you can make changes and push the changes back to the shared repository and submit the pull request. So before I kind of show some screenshots about the process, just so that you know, this could be a bit maddening if you're not familiar with Bash. In the local development environment, you need to use just a few commands to communicate with your operating system through your terminal, and you don't need to know very many. Here are a few commands just to get you started. The other commands we'll use are basically Git software commands, but you can use CD, which means change directory. Directory is the name for just a folder in your local development environment. CD and then the directory name. By the way, when you see something that has little carets, it's a variable. Directory name is, you would put the actual directory name there in place of the carets and the words directory name. You can move back a directory by doing cd ... And a commonly used command to list the folders and files in a directory is ls, although I usually just click open the folder and just look at it visually. By the way, there are some tasks that could vary by operating system, and in the resources I've given, there are some, there's a link to the GitHub documentation, and at the top of articles that have special operating system instructions, there are tabs, just so you know. For instance, with my command line, it uses a $sign as the command line prompt. Yours might not, just so you know. So I'm going to show you a generic process that you can use for a shared repository or a fork. The important thing is that you are cloning whatever repo you have write permission to. So let's go back to the screenshot of my local development environment. I'm working in the home directory, and I know that because the name of the home directory is at the top of my command line and in front of the prompt. And the reason why this matters is because the repo will be cloned into the directory we are working in. So I'm going to type the command git clone into the command line and paste the web address from the browser. It could be, this is the web address to a fork, but it could be to the shared repository, like I said, and hit enter. So we'll now have a folder in the home directory with the same name as the GitHub repo. So in this case, it's 2017.djangocon.us, and it's going to be filled with the contents of the repo. So I now have a copy of the code online in the GitHub repo and a copy in my local development environment. So I will change directory into the folder so I can work on it there. You do that by typing cd and then the repo or folder name, same thing. And I've clicked on the folder in the folder window so I can see the contents visually. But I can also see, let's see, I can also see that I'm working from within that directory because the name of it is at the top of my command line window and it's in front of the command line prompt. Hypothetically, if I were to open the GitHub repo and open my local development files in front of it, I would be able to see the corresponding files, but they will look somewhat different because in the browser, you know, the files are being rendered by the browser, and locally they are more like what I would call raw files. This is kind of optional in this situation. There's only one branch right now, so you know you're on the master branch, but it matters if there's more than one branch. You can type git branch to verify which branch you are on. Initially, you will be checked out on the default branch. In this case, it's master. So we can create and check out. Checkout means switch to a feature branch, and we're going to call it example branch. We want to branch off the branch we intend our changes to be merged into. And this is something very useful to know if you're not familiar with working with Git locally. When you switch to a new branch, the files in your local development environment switch to the files of that branch. It's like magic. And you may not notice the difference at first because when you create a new branch, it's a copy of another one. But if you make a change in that new branch and you switch back to another branch, you can see the difference. So open a file in the text editor, make your change and save it. And then we need to add and commit our change to the Git version control. And we also create a message. By the way, make sure that your changes work, whatever change you're proposing, and you probably would want to use a more specific message if you're actually doing this for real. So now we can push the new branch, example branch, to GitHub to our origin, whichever place we have write permission to. So if you go to that repo, there's going to be a new branch there, and there will be a message. And the branch is not really affecting anything else, it just exists. And if you click on the branch tab, you can choose the name of the branch to switch to the new branch. And you can toggle back and forth between the branches by clicking on the branches in the branch tab. And you can see the change you've made. I didn't really highlight it, but if you look through the files, you'll see, for instance, that you updated a file 2 minutes ago or something like this, and you can toggle back and forth and compare the change. So this is important. To submit the pull request, you want to go to the repo that you want your pull request to be merged into. And the reason why I say that is because you can actually submit a pull request to yourself in your own fork. And GitHub will let you do that. You want to go to the DjangoCon US website repo in this case. And there will also be a message there telling you about the branch, because even if you submitted it through a fork, GitHub will detect it. So you click on compare and pull request. It's a button near the top. We want to make sure the base branch is the branch you want your changes merged into. And then the compare branch will be your branch. And so you create a pull request title, maybe a description. If the pull request is through a forked repo, there will be a box checked by default giving maintainers the ability to edit the pull request. So double check your changes and click Create Pull Request. Now we're going to review the two different types of pull requests as a DjangoCon US website repo maintainer. What happens firstly when a pull request is submitted is that the repo maintainers will receive a notification by browser or by email to let them know there's a pull request. And you can actually change, let's see, sorry, I'm looking at the forum right now. You can change your notification settings if you want to. Someone just asked if I recommend creating a second undisclosed private GitHub account for practice if you're using your original GitHub account as your portfolio. What I think is this. I think you should do whatever enables you to have the confidence to go out and find the opportunities that help you grow your skills. I can tell you that when I first started working on the DjangoCon US website, I accidentally deleted an important branch, and it was really a learning process because it ended up not being a big deal at all. There were several people who had committed recently, and the person who most recently committed pushed the branch, a new branch. Well, after a while, I had done much more work, and I had gotten better, and it was a learning experience. And it went, if you go to the repo, you would have to go back really, really far to see that I did that. So I think, you know, at times, if you're making a lot of progress, it might not matter, but I do not think there is anything wrong with having a private account if that's what you feel comfortable with. I think the most important thing for you is improving your skills. So that's just my opinion. If anyone else has an opinion or thoughts on it, you know, feel free to say something about it. Thanks for the question. Okay, so someone has been notified there's a pull request, and wherever they're notified, they're going to have a link to the pull request tab in the browser. So they're going to look over the information about the pull request, and there will be the title and possibly a description. There will be a file. You can click Files Changed, and it's basically going to show you a file similarly to the regular files in a repo, except it's just going to show you as kind of, it's going to consolidate the changes that were made in that pull request. So underneath that, there will be info about how to merge the pull request. There will be a merge button that you can click to merge in the browser, and there will be a link that says command line instructions. When you click on that link, it opens up a set of instructions for how to review and merge the pull request in your local development environment. The instructions are different, like I said, depending on how the pull request was submitted, whether through a shared repository or a forked repository, and I'm going to go over that in a minute. So let's look at what our options are. There are some instances where you just look at the file in the browser and you can just see that you can accept it. Like, say, for instance, there was a typo and someone fixed it. It's probably still a good idea if you have some kind of external, test check. It's good to make sure pretty often that your tests are passing, but you could sometimes go to that merge button and just click it without running the code locally. Or say, for instance, the pull request basically is okay, but there's some little thing that needs to be fixed, like they made a typo, just hypothetically. You can open up the pull request file just like regular files in a repo using the pencil icon, and you can make a change and save it, and then you could click merge. The other options involve fetching the pull request into your local development environment and running the code there. So say, for instance, you do that and a change does not need to be made, you could go back to the browser and just click merge, because you don't need to do anything else with the code locally except delete your branch, which we'll talk about later. If you need to make a change, or someone needs to, you could do a few different things. You can ask the pull request author to make a change to the pull request, or you could make the change yourself. And if you make the change, you could do a couple different things. You can push your change to GitHub, to the browser, to add your change to the branch, and it will be added to the pull request. Or you can make the change locally yourself. You can merge the branch with the branch you want it to be intended to merge with locally. And you can push the branch, your changes, live to GitHub. For instance, you have a feature branch, you merge it with your master branch locally, and you push the change to the master branch on GitHub. And actually, part of the instructions in the pull request tab, the second part will tell you how to do that. So this is why the pull request instructions are different in the little pull request tab. So say, for instance, I'm a maintainer for DjangoCon US website. That's my origin because I cloned from there. You're able to fetch any updates that have been made since you cloned or since the last time you fetched. You can fetch those updates into your local development environment into a folder. It's called .git. It's a hidden folder. But these updates will only include branches that were made directly to the DjangoCon US website repo. They do not include branches made through a fork, because those are outside of the origin. The branches made through a fork have to be pulled individually into our local development environment. And by the way, if you ever want to read more about this, these branches in the .git folder that you fetched kind of temporarily, they're called remote tracking branches. And they're referred to it's a bit different than if you push and pull. If you are referring to a remote tracking branch in the .git folder, you use the convention the remote name / branch name. And you'll see that in the pull request instructions sometimes. So these instructions on this slide, these are basically the first part of the pull request instructions for either a shared repo branch or a forked repo branch, except for the push part. The top sections are. These instructions can be used by any maintainer to work on any branch they have write permission to. This is kind of confusing because they call them pull request instructions, but they're actually just instructions for dealing with a branch in general. If a pull request has already been made and you push additional commits to the pull request, they're to the branch, they're automatically added to the pull request if a pull request has been submitted on the branch, up to the point that the pull request has been merged. Because at that point, you're closing the pull request and you're deleting the branch. So for a shared repository pull request, like I said, we're fetching the updates. So git fetch origin. We're going to create and check out to a new local branch, and we're giving a name to it. That's what branch name is. And then you can see the convention for the remote tracking branch. Because we fetched the updates, we have the pull request is now temporarily stored as origin / branch name because it's from the origin and the branch name. So we are inserting the pull request branch contents from the .git folder into our new local branch by referring to it as the remote tracking branch name. And GitHub suggests to merge master into your branch, your pull request branch you're on. That would be a way that you can keep it up to date with master, for instance, if someone has made some change to it since the pull request was submitted, I guess. So you can also, like I said, you could make a change and push the additional commits to the branch. And that's what git push origin branch name would do. And the additional commits would go to the branch if it's just a feature branch, or it would be added to the pull request if there's a pull request pending. So for the pull request submitted through a fork, like I said, we can't fetch those through the origin. So we create and check out switch to a branch. We're branching off of master in this case because there's only one branch. There's only the master branch, I mean. This is just like before when we created a branch locally, we did git checkout.b and then the branch name. We're doing this similar thing to create a branch, and then we're going to pull the contents of the forked repo branch. We're going to pull it into the new branch locally by using the URL of the fork and the branch name. And if the pull request author has given permission to, if they've left that little box checked by default to give maintainers permission to edit the pull request, you could actually push additional commits to that pull request by using git push and then the URL and the branch name. And I've got another little handy piece of code in case your local branch name is different than the remote branch name to the fork. You can use that to be able to still push to it if you so choose. So then pushing would be if you've made a change and added and committed it and then pushed. If you decide instead to merge locally, basically this is the piece of code that's in the instructions. You're checking out to the master branch because there's only the master branch in this case. You're merging the feature branch into it, and then you're pushing the change to the live master branch on GitHub. So after the pull request is closed, it's good practice to delete the feature branch in the browser and locally because when you change things in one place in GitHub or Git, it doesn't update in the other place, so you have to do it manually. So for the browser, there will be a button on the pull request page that you can click to delete the feature branch, or you can go to the branches tab. The first two commands are to delete the branch locally, git branch -d branch name. Sometimes you have to force the delete. For instance, I think if you haven't merged the branch, that's an example. So you would do git branch -D branch name. And then if you want to delete a remote branch, a branch on GitHub, if you want to do that from your command line, you can do git push and then the remote name space : branch name. So I'm not really going to cover these, but these are some advanced topics you might want to be aware of. Rebase, interactive rebase. These are ways of reordering your commits. For instance, if you've done some work and you want it to be the most recent work on the branch, you can use rebase or interactive rebase to do that. Merge conflicts are where you have two different people have made a change that affects the same part of a file and you need to choose one of them. Another couple of interesting things, aliases. Sometimes when people get better at reviewing pull requests, they might start to find some shortcuts. And if you kind of do some research, people will sometimes use something called an alias to be able to make a little nickname for some command, and they can just have a short, simple command, for instance, to fetch a pull request by its number or something like this. You can also fetch individual pull request branches, and in the resources, I'm going to have some code about that for fun if you're interested in that. So we're going to look at some additional workflow and command info. I think I might save this for later for the end, since I have had a few technical problems. It might be easier to go through the slides first. Github Flow, the workflow I've used, I'm just going to check the forum just a second. Okay, I don't see any question right now. The workflow I've used has been basically what Github Flow is. And it consists of merging your pull request into a master branch. And then that might be deployed live, for instance, in the case of the DjangoCon website. And this, is a good workflow for that situation, because it's a high traffic site, but people are able, for instance, to make some small changes to it or something like this. We don't really need a complicated process. But there are some situations where you might want to do some kind of, I guess, what I'd call gatekeeping. Another type of workflow would be that you have a develop branch that you deploy to a staging site. So you can see what it looks like, and the public doesn't really know about this staging site. It's just for the developers. And then if you're happy with that, occasionally you will merge the develop branch into the master branch, and then that might go live. And I mean, there's not really, people have some passionate views about what workflow is the best. There's not really a best, in my opinion. You should use the workflow that fits what you're trying to accomplish, because they all have good things and bad things. There is a really, really good article called A Successful Git Branching Model. And it's quite advanced, but it will tell you a lot about what it's like in an environment where they have like tagged releases, like where you have a huge release occasionally, and hot fixes and how you do that. I highly recommend that you read that article if you want to know more about that. There's some different view. Someone wrote a blog post, a successful Git branching model considered harmful. And in the comments, other people jumped in and said their own way of doing it. I know if you look at Atlassian and GitLab documents, they will also give some insights about different processes. And it just tells you, you learn by reading about why and how people do it other ways. And this is a little bit unrelated, but there's also a version control methodology called Semver that's pretty popular and good to know. You might also want to check into that. So I'm going to talk about people, communication, and documentation. This slide, that's not supposed to be read. Sorry about that. I want to direct you to a couple of resources as food for thought. One of them is a survey by Eric Elliott. He surveyed, or his group surveyed 1,000 developers to talk about how they achieve 10 times more results. And what's interesting is that some of the answers were not code related. Some of the most important things that you can do have to do with being a mentor, have to do with how you communicate and how you collaborate, your people skills. And I also want to direct you to an open source survey completed by GitHub. Basically, what it showed is that documentation is the thing that is left out most often, but it is also considered to be basically the most useful thing. So some of the things I told you about already in the talk were things that were hard for me to find. And so I have a tendency to want to dwell on those things, but actually the documentation and your people skills are extremely important and really are not less important. It's just a different type of skill. So I hope that you will all think about your communication strategy. You can definitely go to our DjangoCon US website, repo documentation. I put the links in the useful resources. Your README, which tells about your project. Your license tells the legality of using the code and the contributions you make. The code of conduct is about what behavior and expectations there are for contributors and community members. And contributing can actually just go step by step through the process of contributing. And in the simulation exercise I've put a contributing document, and I've also put templates. There is something called an issue template and a pull request template, and I put examples, and you'll be able to see what they do. For instance, if someone goes to submit an issue, when they click on it, the issue template will populate some questions about what your issue is. And also there will be a little message at the top prompting you to read the contributing document. And I think also now, let's see, I'm trying to think. I think it suggests reading a couple different documents. And also, if you need a communication forum, GitHub has built-in wikis. You can also use GitHub pages, Jekyll, or I don't know how to say this, Gists? I've never said it before. So I've got a few recommendations, just things I think are really important. Like I said, I accidentally deleted a really important branch once, and it was totally fine, and I learned from it. And if you have the authority, and if you're a maintainer, I suggest going into the repo settings, clicking the branches tab and protecting the main branch so it can't be deleted. For example, you might want to protect your master branch. A few other safety considerations: you might want to back up the repo. You can require reviews of pull requests, so that firstly, people have to submit a pull request, and secondly, someone else, more than one person reviews it before it's merged. You can use status checks like Travis CI to make sure your build is correct. If needed, you can also revert pull requests. As a worst case scenario, I've included an article in the resources section about how to recover a deleted branch. And sensitive data warning: if data is made public, you should consider it compromised and immediately remove it and change it, because even if it was just on there for a split second, you can't know if it's safe. A few productivity helpers: password caching is a great thing to do, so that when you're pushing changes to GitHub, you don't have to put your password over and over again. A few fun things: you can close issues by using commit messages in your command line. You can save replies on GitHub for if you're replying to people's issues or pull requests. You can also link to specific line numbers on GitHub. And my best tip for getting started: in my useful resources section, I've included an excellent checklist from the GitHub open source documentation about evaluating a project. And I recommend taking a look, but I recommend that you find projects that use triaging. Triaging is where issues are sorted by difficulty level, so that you can choose issues that fit your level, and that can help you level up. But also, as a code reviewer, as a collaborator or code reviewer, you can cherry pick issues and pull requests that fit your skill level. And that's a way that you can get your foot in the door to contribute and learn as you go. And practice your skills and workflow. Don't be afraid to delete and start over if that's what you have to do to learn, like deleting your files in your local development environment and re-cloning, for instance. Also, I think I mentioned this earlier, you can use your own user account as a sandbox. In the example I gave, we didn't want to do that, but you could just create a repo in your user account and submit a pull request to yourself and then review it. I think it only will let you review one type of pull request, though. That's a disadvantage of it. So I'm going to debunk a few myths. These are things I thought when I started looking at GitHub. I thought the repos looked perfect. I thought the people were probably experts. They seemed to know exactly what they were doing. It seemed to be all about code. And actually, that's not true. If you start to spend enough time on GitHub, you will find many places for improvement. A huge area is documentation. There are endless opportunities to help with documentation. That's actually a way you can get started with possibly feeling a bit less pressure, is by learning about the project and documenting it. People of all types, all skill and knowledge levels contribute to open source on GitHub. Behind the scenes, GitHub is actually a pretty messy place. There's a lot of self-organization and creativity and debate. And it isn't all about code. Like I showed, I got started with, a taco recipe sharing thing. And there's a fear by a lot of people that they're going to break something. I know that's scary, but Git is really resilient. But like I said, I do think it's helpful to learn the process itself for your competence level, and hopefully find some environment where the people are very supportive in your learning. So kind of my last recommendation is that you're welcome to contribute to the DjangoCon US website next year. We have a diverse group of contributors of all skill levels. and we're always looking for more contributors, so feel free to let us know if you're interested. So we're going to do this exercise. It's through GitHub Classroom, and I've never done anything quite like this, so hopefully it will go well. Basically what it is that I'll be able to give all of you a link, or whoever's interested. I'll give you a link and you will follow it, and it will set up basically an organizational repo for you. And I will have a pull request exercise you can do, but you can also use it to experiment and, you know, in a place with not much pressure. You may have already done these things, but you need to have a GitHub account. You don't have to have Git installed, but it would be a really good idea if you want to get the full benefit of the exercise, because ideally, or today or later, you could do this. It's a good idea to practice reviewing pull requests in your local development environment, because in my opinion, that's the hardest thing to level up on. That's my opinion. So you want to be able to find and open your command line on your computer and do a bit of navigating with the bash commands like I told you about. It might be helpful to have a text editor, and I'm going to have also documentation in the useful resources section. Just by the way, if you need help, I'm going to include GitHub help guides. You can also get help on the command line. I put a couple examples here. There's also a thing with keyboard shortcuts that is not working for me lately, but it used to be if you typed a question mark, it would pull up a set of keyboard shortcuts. So in general, feel free to contact me if you make any progress based on my talk. I'd love to know. I've got a link there. My slides are not quite complete at the link, but you're welcome to go there. And I'm going to get this repo ready. I've got a couple questions here. Let's see, when you say documentation, does that mean creating README files? Yes, it definitely means creating a README file. That's probably the one document you should always have, ideally. And then we can look at an example of the README for DjangoCon US. Let's see. Oh, let's see. Documentation is quite broad. Oh, thank you. It can be how-to guides, tutorials, beginners guides, API reference. Thank you for giving that information. Yeah, documentation can mean a lot of different things. And I guess how much you need probably depends on the project. I would say definitely giving people the information to at least use it and contribute to it. That's what I would say is most important of all. It's really not about how much documentation it has, because I'm sure one size does not necessarily fit all. Okay, so I'm going to go to GitHub Classroom. I need to prepare something. It'll just take me a minute. If people have any other questions, feel free to ask or jump in and answer while I'm doing this. While you're waiting, I know I will. I'll show you the repo that this exercise is based on, so you can get an idea of what we're doing. And like I said, it's the first time I've done this. Hopefully it's going to, hopefully it'll make sense. And if You know, if people have any problems as they go along, I can't, hopefully it all makes sense and it's all accurate, but we'll work through it if there's any problem. So if you go to that repo, you'll see that what's going to happen is that if you want to do it, you'll get a repo of your own that will be a copy of that repo. And I will have a file in its own branch, and you can submit that as a pull request, and then you can review the pull request locally, or if you just want to take a look at the repo online, you don't have to do it locally, but I do recommend going through the process, or you yourself creating your own pull request and going through the process so that you will be more confident in the future to go back and to seek out opportunities. Okay, so I've just put a link on there. Hopefully well, if you click on it, it should create your own personal repo. And if you have any problems, let me know. I'm going to stay online. I'm going to stay online and help people through if needed. If you don't want to do it and you know, it's up to you. Totally. No pressure at all. And I think I talked about, let's see. I said I was going to go over some additional commands. Actually, I will do that because I better change this. Okay. And if anyone has any, if you find any bug in it, let me know so I can communicate it. Any bug in the simulation exercise. And by the way, if you want to ask me questions privately, you're welcome to. You can, I've got my email address on my GitHub, or in the future, I'm happy to take questions privately. Let's see. Just to talk through that part that I left out, at the bottom of this resources document, so I've got the bash commands, which I had on a slide, and then I have the generic local development environment. And an example, let's see, generic code for reviewing a shared repo pull request. And pushing to the branch if you so choose. Under reviewing a forked repo pull request, something that's interesting to know is that, well, it's kind of annoying actually. When you review a pull request that's from a fork, GitHub suggests the name of the local branch that you make, and it adds the username to the beginning of the branch name. And there's a bit of code here that I think is useful, because if you use GitHub's instructions and you make a slightly different branch name, it will make it harder to push to the forked repo pull request. But there's a bit of code here where you can specify the local branch name : and the remote branch name, so that you can still push updates to it if you want to. Here's the bit of code about fetching individual pull requests. Of course, if you use that, you're not really working on it as a feature branch. You're just working on it directly as a pull request, because you're fetching it as pull request number. Commands for deleting a branch. This is useful to know. For branches, if the branch already exists, you don't need to use -b. -b is what creates the branch. So earlier, we actually used both git checkout -b and git checkout. If you are using more than one branch, like if you're using master and develop, this is very useful to know. You can specify what branch you are branching off of, because if you're in the branch you're branching off of, it will automatically make a copy of that branch. If you're in the other branch, you need to specify the branch you're branching off of. So that's git checkout-b and then the branch name, and then after that a space and the branch you're branching off of. A very commonly used piece of code, anytime you make a change to a file, whether you are creating a feature or working on someone else's feature branch or pull request branch, if you make a change, then you need to commit it to version control before you push to GitHub. So you can use git add dot git commit -m and then put your note. Got a couple parts that's strange. I could have sworn that I did something different here earlier. Well, anyway, I'm gonna fix these sections that are okay. Common push and pull commands. You can use the remote name and the branch name. Commonly, you would do git pull origin master or git push origin master. That's probably the most common of all. You can push a pull using the URL like we showed with reviewing a forked pull request branch. I didn't talk about this in the talk earlier, but pull is a combination of fetch and merge. So when we fetch the updates, we were using one of these commands, but you can use git fetch and the remote name to fetch the updates, and then you can actually check out to a branch and merge the updates into whatever branch it is that you're wanting to update to keep it up to date. You could do that with your master branch or a feature branch. And also good to know is that when you're working from a clone from a fork, when the shared repository, organizational repository, when an update is made to that, your fork does not automatically update. And it's not always practical to delete it and refork. So what you can do, you can add the shared repository to your local clone. You can add it as a remote. The common convention is to call it an upstream. So you can do git remote add upstream and then the URL to the shared repository. And you can use that to keep your fork up to date, because you can, instead of doing git fetch origin, you can do git fetch upstream. And for example, check out to your master branch, merge the remote tracking branch into it. So git merge upstream master. And then do git push origin master, which will push the update to the master branch of your fork on GitHub. And that's how you keep your fork up to date. And keeping your feature branch up to date, similarly to what I talked about earlier, you could do git checkout feature branch and, for instance, merge your master branch into it by doing git merge master. And I think that's about it. Let me look at our forum, see if there's any. Oh, sure, beginner-friendly projects. Let's see. Well, one that's extremely beginner-friendly is that I've heard about quite a lot recently from DjangoCon is PyBeware. PyB. the person who runs it actually is advocate for, you know, helping new people contribute. That's only one example, though. Let me find a few other initiatives here. And by the way, if you have any questions about the simulation, or you have any problems or find any bugs, you know, feel free to say something. There are quite a few like this. First timers only. And oh, I will tell you something good to know about. There's something called, this is coming up soon, it's called Hacktoberfest. And I know last year I contributed a lot of pull requests during Hacktoberfest. Basically, during October, there's an initiative between DigitalOcean and GitHub. And it's an initiative for people to make contributions. And I think if you make 5, you get a t-shirt from DigitalOcean. And what will happen is that many projects, knowing that people are looking to contribute, they will make a special effort to put issues and tags on GitHub, and you can just look through them and find places to contribute to, and they will be waiting for people to contribute. So that's a really good time to get involved if you feel a bit self-conscious about contributing, because so many people will be doing it. So does anyone have any feedback about how it's going, if you're learning anything, or if it's working as intended? Awesome. I'm so glad that you're finding this useful, not waving. That makes me really, really happy. It's you can kind of start to think that what you know, as you get better at it, you tend to forget, you know, how it can be helpful to other people. So I'm so glad, really, really glad it's helpful to people. I'm trying to think of anything else to add. Like I said, if anyone, needs additional help, I'm happy to answer questions going forward. To whoever asked about, if it's okay to branch off of a feature branch, I would say yes, but you probably want to merge it back into the feature branch. Might start to get a bit messy if you did anything else with it, but I don't see any problem with it. I just don't think you would have to do it very often. just putting the Hacktoberfest website information online. It's not updated for this year yet, but it should be soon. And another possible way to contribute is that a lot of local cities will have open source projects. And you can go to meetups and get to know people, and you can help with their projects on GitHub. And that's another way to find opportunities to level up. And if anybody else has any, tips, happy to accept them on the forum if you want to add anything.